Well, hey there, prolific authors. I have a really great interview for you today with author Matty Dalrymple. We're going to talk about her story frame and how she uses it. We're going to touch on a lot of things like writing both long and short stories, using spreadsheets to help plan your story and keep things straight, the why of certain scenes, and if you have ever had to delete a lot of words from your manuscript, just throw them away. She's probably deleted more. So we're going to talk about that too, along with, of course, her story frame. But before we get into that, I just wanted to remind you that August 22nd is coming up on us fast. We're going to do our first Finding the Heart of Your Story boot camp. It is free for all authors. I'm going to show you how to find the emotional core of your story, use it to build out your plot. And then we're also going to talk about how to market more effectively using the internal stuff. Okay, so it's going to be totally free. It's probably going to change your perspective on how you write your story and how that story feeds into your marketing, right? So I think you're going to find a lot of value in it. If you haven't signed up yet, make sure and do so at bit.ly/storyheart. I will have that link in the show notes. And make sure that you do that so that you are getting the emails for when and where we're going to go live and do the teaching as well as the replays. Okay, so it's going to be really fun. There's going to be lots of authors there, and I hope to see you there. Without further ado, let's get to our conversation with Matty. All right, welcome back to the Prolific Author Podcast. We are here with Matty Dalrymple. How are you?
Great, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, good. So you are an author. You write suspense, mystery, and thriller, which I write too. So we have that in common. So why don't you start by introducing yourself and telling everyone, who you are and about what you write?
Sure. I am the author of the Ann Kinnear suspense novels and suspense shorts and the Lizzie Ballard thrillers. And I also podcast, speak, write, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the indie author.
Nice, nice. All right. So you said that you write shorts. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I had started writing short fiction because I wrote the first one or two books of the Ann Kinnear suspense novels. And then I got this idea for another novel that I wanted to work on. So all my books have a theme of what happens when an extraordinary ability transforms an ordinary life. And in the Ann Kinnear books, the extraordinary ability is that Ann is able to sense spirits. She has a business around this that's run by her brother that involves contracts and consulting engagements. It's all very businesslike. And then I had an idea for another story, but it depended on a different kind of extraordinary ability. That became the Lizzie Ballard thrillers. And I can't really say what Lizzie's extraordinary ability is because it would be a bit of a spoiler. But while I was working on the first of those books, which was Rock, Paper, Scissors, I wanted to give my Ann Kinnear fans something to sort of tide them over. So I wrote a couple of Ann Kinnear short stories, 4,000 or 5,000 words. And then as it became clear that Lizzie Ballard was going to be a trilogy, I was writing more to continue to tide the Ann fans over. So I ended up, I think I now have 7 or 8 short stories, all but one of which are available on the retail platforms as standalone ebooks, and then one that I retain as a reader magnet. And on the basis of that experience, I co-wrote with Mark Leslie Lefebvre the book Taking the Short Tack, which is how authors can create income and connect with readers using their short fiction.
Nice, yeah. And so one question I have about that is, how do you balance your time between writing the longer stuff and writing the shorter stuff? Do you just take a day here and there to write the short stuff, or do you have a particular process for getting to all of it?
Well, I never really plan the short stories. They just have to kind of come to me. And I sort of find that the short stories end up being triggered by an idea that I think would be fun to examine in miniature. So as an example, in 2019, my husband and I were on a cruise from Hawaii to Vancouver. And along the line, because I write sort of darker novels, I started thinking about the whole concept of falling overboard or jumping overboard, as the case may be. And so I thought that would be kind of an interesting thing to write about in the context of a character who contacts dead people for a living. And so it wasn't that I had that I started out with a big overarching theme that I wanted to address. I just thought, well, this is kind of an interesting topic and I'm going to use a short story to explore it. But those ideas pop up kind of irregularly. And my hope is that when I have a couple more, I want to have enough so I have a year of Kinnear. So it would be 12 short stories based on Anne Kinnear, one for each month of the year. But I just have to kind of wait for those to come along. Whereas the stories, I mean, the novels are much more planned out, scheduled out, more strategic. Yeah.
So you just write the short stories kind of wherever you can once they come to you around the bigger ones. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. Now, I really like that you said that you have this overarching theme for your story about, transforming an ordinary life. That's really fun. So tell me about how you craft your stories then, because that's something that you do even consulting on outside of your own fiction, right?
Yeah, well, I think that gets to something I've been really interested in lately, which is this idea of a story frame.
Mm-hmm.
So in the July-August issue of Writer's Digest, I have an article called Creating Your Story Frame. And it tells the sad story of Anne Kinnear, book 5. The book that took me longest to write was latest against my own deadline and involved the largest number of thrown away words. So I had an idea that was, there was a winery near me in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and I wanted to use it as a setting for an Anne Kinnear story. Mystery and wine and books, like it just doesn't get any better than that. And so I was working on it, and I put together what I thought was a pretty extensive sort of treatment of it, and thought, okay, that's good. I'm gonna dive in. And I dove in, and I got caught in what I like to think of as the wouldn't this be cooler dilemma, because I had, let's say, 70, 80,000 words, and I would think I was almost ready to send it to the editor. And then I would think, oh, but what would be cooler is if this character has a different profession, or, I mean, early on, I actually changed the nature of the crime and the person who committed it. Fortunately, I wasn't 80,000 words in when I did that, but there was a lot of thrash going on, and there were those big changes, like who's the bad guy. But there were even little changes, like there was a character in it who was pregnant. And the first time I wrote in my first draft, she was just, she was very early in her pregnancy, so it wasn't apparent. And so there were scenes where characters would find out that she was pregnant and, comment accordingly. And then later I realized it would be cooler if she were much further along in her pregnancy. So she was almost, about to give birth. So not only did I have to change that, but I had to go find every occurrence where someone said, oh, I didn't realize you were pregnant, because it was obvious,
Right.
And so it was a combination of the big things and the little things that required a lot of finessing. But I think once you have that idea about what would be cooler for the reader, you really can't turn your back on it. You kind of have to follow that regardless of the cost you pay. And so what I decided to do with book 6, which I'm working on now, and which is the basis for the article in Writer's Digest, is to create a story frame. And I use that analogy because I love all things nautical for the writing craft and the publishing voyage. And so my idea was you wouldn't start putting on what I call the prose bright work. So in nautical terminology, bright work is the highly varnished woodwork that you see, especially on old classic boats, which I think is the perfect analogy for carefully crafted prose.
Right.
And you wouldn't start at the back of the boat and then start building and polishing as you go. Because, if you've made a mistake in the frame of the boat that's going to spring a leak, that's going to sink the reader in the middle of your voyage, then you've invested all that time and effort for nothing.
Right.
And so what I did is I created this frame for the story, and it was something that was built upon layer by layer. So the first time I might go by, and for each chapter or each scene, I would say, Anne goes to the winery and meets her client. And then I did the whole story like that. And then I would go through, and maybe on the second pass, it was Anne goes to the winery and meets her client, who turns out to be the former owner of a rival winery. And each time I would pass through, it would get more and more framed out.
Right.
Until I ended up sending my editor. The other thing about Ann Kinnear 5 was I had to get it edited twice, which was painful and expensive.
Right.
So I made an arrangement with my editor that I would give him this frame. He would critique that, and then he would do a regular edit on the final manuscript. And but so I sent him probably about 20,000 words. I mean, it was a beefy frame.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was how I ended up being able to make all those recover from those decisions about like how pregnant is she and who is the bad guy.
Yeah.
And it was also nice because it gave me the chance to do things like, and I was just looking at your 9 essential plot points blog post and listening to the podcasts. And you can also superimpose that kind of thing on it. If you have a structure that you like, then you can take that kind of structure and you can hold it up to the frame instead of a bunch of more or less polished words and say, oh, you know what? I'm missing a whole plot point or whatever that might be. So that's a long answer to the question about what my process is now that I wish had been my process earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's basically about developmental editing and getting the story planned so that you're not throwing away tons of words. So dare we ask how many you threw away for that book 5?
Oh man. I mean, I probably wrote in essence a second novel.
Really?
I mean, I probably threw away as many words as it ended up being, which was about 85,000 words.
Wow.
And sometimes I did it, chapters at a time. And sometimes it was, what I have to go in and take out all those references to people being surprised that she's pregnant. So, it happened in different ways, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if I threw away 80 or 85,000 words.
Yeah. And that's definitely painful. So
yeah.
What do you put into the frame then? What are what are like your benchmarks for the frame?
So the guidelines I use for the frame are that it would be just the description. So no dialogue, or I should say just a description of what happens, no detail.
Okay.
No detail about like the description of what it looks like as one looks over the over the vineyard, or no dialogue between the characters, because that's the kind of thing you can spend a ton of time on and maybe doesn't end up getting used. I ended up using a different font because I use Scrivener, and I normally use Palatino as the font that I, when I'm actually writing, that's what I'm using. And I actually used Optima, which is a sans serif font, because I wanted to emphasize to myself that this was a different mindset. And having that kind of less decorative font helped me get myself in that frame of mind. I also started each of these scenes with the point of view character's name in caps. So Anne goes to the winery and meets her prospective client.
Right.
And that was nice because in Scrivener and, other writing softwares as well, I could look through all the chapter headings or the early words of the chapter and say, oh, I have an Anne point of view character scene. Then I have Mike. Then I have Anne and Mike and Mike and Mike and Mike and Mike. No, that's not going to work. So it helped me work out that. It also helped remind me about point of view, so I didn't go wandering off accidentally into somebody else's point of view. I always use present tense in the frame, again, to keep my mind on the fact that I'm just describing what the action is. And then 2 other things that I found super helpful were to capture the scenes in chronological order as they happen in the story. So I think especially for people who write mysteries, there are often flashbacks, or there's all the stuff that happens before the story opened. Even if you don't ever tell it as a flashback, it's important to set the scene for the story. So I wrote all of those. I mean, I framed them all out and I put them in order. So even if I was going to include them in a flashback, I didn't include it in the frame where it would appear to the reader. I included it where it would happen chronologically.
Okay. And
then the last thing, which really would have helped me out with Ann Kinnear 5, is to put notes in there about why I'm doing certain things. So probably 10,000 of the 80,000 words I threw away were because I wrote, one draft, and then I wrote back, and I got to the point where it said, Anne took the long way from the winery to downtown. And I thought, well, that's silly. I'll just have her go the short way. So I would rewrite all that. And then 3 pages later, it would be like, because Anne had gone the long way, she happened to see such and such. I was like, oh, yeah. And then I would have to go back, and regroup. And so even if it sounded silly to me, I would put notes in the frame that would say, Anne's going the long way because she has to see this thing that happens.
Right.
And that has saved me a ton of thrash in book 6. So those are kind of the guidelines. Use a different font, start with a point of view character scene, just describe the actions, not the dialogue or the detail, chronological order, and including the notes about why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really love all of that, because especially as authors, we're very prone to let our story carry us away and go off on all these tangents. So it's really important for us to keep focused. Yeah. And I think people kind of underestimate things like the font and, like mindset things that just put you in a kind of a different frame of mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that you talked about the why of why you're doing this. And I really think that's important in story in general. I mean, obviously in this case, to keep you focused and, not going off in some way that you're going to have to fix later on. But I also think it helps you explore your story now and know better, the different elements of your story. I mean, have you found that to be the case?
Yeah, well, it definitely makes those big changes like, it's actually somebody else is the bad guy, much easier to decide when you have 10,000 words on the page than if you have 80,000 words on the page.
Right.
And all this is not to say that then before I say that, I'll say that I just kept making pass after pass after pass through the frame. And at some point, I just frankly got bored with it. I'm like, you know what? I just can't read this again. I'm only changing 7% of what I'm reading. And so I started morphing it into the manuscript. The thing that I don't like about an outline, anything that has indents and Roman numerals seems like not what I want to associate with my creative work, but also it's very separate. It's like there's the outline and then there's the manuscript. And what I liked about the frame is I could just keep going through until I thought, you know what, this scene is feeling so solid that I'm going to change it to my nice serif font. I'm going to change it to past tense, and I'm going to start making it into the manuscript as I think it will show up for the reader. And right. So, there didn't have to be that disconnect between the strategic thinking about the story and the tactical execution of the story. Okay. But that's not to say that I didn't keep making changes. I mean, I still made changes. It was just, they were smaller and they were less painful.
Right. Right.
I have made changes about a character's personality in the manuscript for book 6. And it's going to be a little bit painful, but not as bad as it would have been.
Right. So have you found that even though you do pass after pass, on your frame until you get it right, is it still saving you a lot of time compared to what you were doing before?
Yeah, it's definitely saving me a lot of time. And it's also, actually, I'll add the other thing that I do to help. This is probably going to make some of your listeners cringe, but I also have a spreadsheet that I apply to this. So at some point, the frame becomes big enough that I'm having trouble keeping track of all the pieces. And again, I think this is really true of people who write mysteries, because you have to keep track of every little red herring, every little true hint you've dropped. And it depending on how complex your plot is, that's difficult to do. And so sort of as a companion piece, once I've gotten far enough in the frame that I find I'm encountering that, I make a spreadsheet that has the characters across the top, the chapters down the side, and then in each cell I put, what does the character do, know, and believe at that point? Mm. So I can put Anne meets her prospective client, which keeps me 7 chapters later from having a scene that's Anne meets her prospective client. She's met him. She doesn't have to act like she's never seen it before. And that's nice because you can read down a row and see everything that happens with that character in the development of that character, whether it's happening on the page, off the page. And then you can also look across and see what's happening with all the characters in a chapter. oh, I see that inexplicably this character is supposed to be talking to the same person that this character is talking to. No, I have to fix that. So they all sound like they might be a little bit time consuming to create, but in the end, for me, at least, it was an overall time saver.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that sounds really valuable. And I like that people do, index cards and things, but I kind of like the idea of having it all there in a spreadsheet. There's something about being able to see it all laid out in front of you that makes it less daunting, when you can just see all of it and kind of know where you need to be at next.
Yeah. The thing that I really like about spreadsheets is the ability to filter views. So if I realize that I have, that Mike's character has kind of gone off the rails, I can hide all the other columns. So I can just focus on what's going on in that row that has, or that column that has Mike's information on it. I find that helpful too, kind of, to only be seeing the part that you're thinking about, but then also being able to step back and see the whole thing.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I've never actually used a spreadsheet. I might try that now. So how much time do you spend planning and going through your frame before you actually start writing, would you say?
Well, I would say that except for Anne Kinnear 5, I'm kind of on like a 9-month schedule. Okay. I don't think any of my books, it's kind of averaging out, also factoring in that as of 2019, I started doing this full time, writing and publishing and podcasting work full time. So my target is every 9 months to get another novel out. And so I would say I'm probably spending a little less than half that time framing it up and a little more than half that time actually writing it. And I'm not doing that full time. I'm doing that among my other publishing work. So I would have no idea about being able to say like a time frame, but I think it breaks out like that, a little less than half, a little more than half.
Okay. Good to know. And before, do you think it was taking you a lot longer from beginning to end to write the books before you started doing the frame?
Well, again, for number 5, dreaded number 5, I had originally planned on trying to get that out 6 months after the previous book. So I published the previous book in April. I wanted to get book 5 out in October. And then it became November, and then became December, and January, ended up being April. So it was almost a year since the publication of my previous book, that book was out. So the learning for me there was both that was very inefficient, and also just that 6 months is not really my schedule. Even if I had been very efficient, I don't think I would have been able to meet that deadline.
Right. So what would you say to people who, maybe want to use this frame, but how do you, come up with all the scenes? Like people saying, yeah, but what if I don't know what happens next to put it in my frame? How do you deal with that?
Well, the nice thing about this is that you can just start wherever. So for a lot of my books, the ideas come to me because of a very specific scene I see in my head. So for my first book, The Sense of Death, the very specific scene I saw in my head was Anne, on one of her consulting engagements, goes to a house. At the time it was San Francisco, because my sister lived in San Francisco and I was spending a lot of time there. Yeah. And she has a sense of something so horrible happening that she can't even go in the house. And in the final book, that happens a third of the way through, maybe. But if that's your idea, then stick your idea in there. And in fact, I just listened to How to Write a Premise for Fiction, which is another one of your podcast episodes. And I thought that was a great, I can see lots of opportunities to meld the premise concept as an entree into the framing concept. Yeah. Or maybe even vice versa. I think different people can use these things in such different ways, but I think those things would be a really nice combination. Right. But I think you can start a frame wherever you have a hook into the story, and it'll work for you.
Good. Yeah, that's good to know, because so many people, you can come up with so many different things as the start of your story. You can come up with a character, or like you said, a scene, or, maybe the ending. And so anywhere that they start, they can just work out from there on the frame.
And I think that really helps. I feel like a lot of, actually my example from The Sense of Death is probably as good an example as any, that many aspects of that ended up in the final book almost exactly the way I pictured them. But but then some of them, it was completely different. And
Mhm.
so capturing that scene, like Anne goes to San Francisco for an engagement and goes into a old Victorian house and can't go in because of the horrible sense she gets.
Right.
If you put that down and then keep building around it, then if you realize that that's really not a scene any reader ever needs to see, it's somehow less gut-wrenching to take it out, even though it was the initial idea that inspired you to write the book, than it is if you've carefully crafted, the ambiance and what she says to the
Right.
people and the description of the beautiful home. And at that point, you're so invested, it's very hard to get rid of it. Whereas if
Yeah.
what you have are a couple of paragraphs just saying what happens, and then if you realize it's not right, it's easier.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a lot of it is because, like you said, the investment and the time that you put into it. There's always, I was talking to Dave Chesson earlier about those memes. I don't see them as much anymore. Now that we have the cloud, it's not as big a deal, but you would see these memes about authors running back into a burning building because their computer's in there and they can't stand the thought of losing those 80,000 words, and having to start over. But what you're saying is if you haven't written those yet and it's just a concept, then it's just not going to be nearly as hard to let it go.
Exactly.
Yeah. I can feel that. Great. So, I mean, what else can you tell us about the frame? Anything else that you want readers to know about it, or listeners to know about it?
I just think, well, one thing that whenever I offer any kind of writing advice, one thing I always like to say is if you have a process that's working for you, please don't try framing.
Right.
If it's working for you, then keep doing whatever's working for you. I think this is just good for people if they're, if the things I'm describing is the things I got stuck on or the things they're getting stuck on, then this is something that worked for me. So something to consider. The other thing I think is that something like a frame or whatever construct makes sense to you is really nice to apply almost any other construct on top of. And so the plot points idea, you could mark in some way in the frame at what point those plot points happen. If you're doing like the 4-act structure, you can visually divide it and say, oh, the scene's a little off. I have like half of it is act 1 and a tenth of it is act 2, and this isn't working. The idea, as I said, of point of view, you can very quickly see, especially in a tool like Scrivener, you can very quickly see if you want to be alternating points of view, whether that's happening or not. And again, it's easy to fix. It's easy to say, I have 3 protagonist point of view scenes in a row. I'm going to combine them into one or whatever. So it works nicely in combination with a lot of other approaches that I've heard writers use successfully.
Yeah. No, that really speaks to me too. And that's why I teach so many different approaches, because what works for one won't work for someone else. And I even say in my my original 9 plot points, explanation that a lot of what I put in there was stuff that I was struggling with at the time that I kept forgetting to put into my stories when I was just getting into it when I was brand new. So yeah, I like the idea that it's so general that it can be used in conjunction with other things.
Yeah.
Great. So is there any kind of book or worksheet that you have that readers could go, or I keep saying readers, that writers could go get that explains this in more detail? I know that you have an article coming out, right? You said in Writer's Digest.
Yep, there's the article in Writer's Digest, and I have I'm thinking through that. So talking about this with people like you is great because it gives me ideas of where I could expand on this concept a little bit. So no book in the offing, but I am collecting ideas, and I can imagine at some point, I don't know that it would ever merit like an entire book on its own. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but
famous last words, right?
a giveaway or something like that. But yeah, it's something that I'm very interested in and I think could help people. So it's something that I'd like to look at in the future.
Yeah.
Documenting more formally.
Good. Yeah, I think that would be really valuable for people. And for me, what I've found, and maybe you can give me your thoughts on this just as kind of a wrap-up question, but there's something about stating things about your story in a really obvious way. Like we kind of know with for example, with crime, we know that it's going to be solving a crime. We know that it's going to be kind of your basic good versus evil, who the murderer was or whatever, so we know those things about our story. But when we actually sit down and say, concretely give words to, this is what the story is about, this is what this character is their motivation is, it's so powerful to get a more authoritative handle on your story by doing that. And for me anyway, that is kind of the appeal of any kind of, whatever it is, a frame or an outline, or because I just suddenly feel like I'm so much more equipped to tell the story without being vague or loopy about anything. I mean, have you found that with your story frame?
Yeah, I think there are two parts to it. One is that the frame definitely helps identify those plot points that don't make sense.
Right.
But what I have found is that there are some issues of characterization, character motivation that I'm never going to get until I start writing the dialogue. And so there was a character in Anne Kinnear 6 that I thought of as in a particular way. And I started writing the dialogue and I'm like, oh, no,
Right,
this isn't feeling right at all. And so that's involving a certain amount of reworking, but again, not as painful. And I can focus my attention at this point on improving the character development, knowing that the plot is in pretty good shape because of the frame.
Nice. Good. Well, hey, thank you so much for coming today and explaining all of this to us. Where can people find you and connect with you?
If they are interested in my fiction work, I am at mattydalrymple.com, and that's Matty with a Y, Matty. And if they're interested in my nonfiction work, I am at theindieauthor.com, and it's indie with a Y, Indy.
Great. I will link those up in the show notes so that people can find you. And yeah, again, just thanks for coming and talking to us today. I think people are going to find a lot of value in this.
Oh, good. Thank you for the invitation. This was fun.
Sure thing.